From the moment BYD launched in Malaysia, there was one car that more people were interested in than anything else from the brand. And it was this, the BYD Seal, because it runs on the very latest architecture from BYD. It's an 800-volt system. It charges faster than any other BYD on the market, but more importantly, it still retains all the benefits of an LFP battery. Now this is the Seal Performance, which means for just 200,000 ringgit, you can go from 0 to 100 in 3.8 seconds. With a fancy suspension setup, a more mature interior than we've ever seen from the brand, my question is this the perfect compact executive saloon? My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the BYD Seal Performance. Now, before we get on to the really fun bits, we have to first talk about the basics. So underneath here, you'll find an 81.5 kilowatt hour LFP battery, which, as I mentioned earlier, is part of the latest 800-volt architecture from BYD. As a result, where other BYD cars charge up to 80 kilowatts, this can accept up to 150 kilowatts, which is, again, the fastest DC charging that BYD has ever afforded. However, AC charging remains at just 7 kilowatts, which means it will take well over 10 hours to charge this thing from dead to full from a compatible AC charger. Now, because this is the Performance, it means that there are two motors. Now, the Premium normally just has a 308 horsepower motor at the rear with about 360 Newton meters of torque, but because this is a dual motor performance model, that means there's another motor in the front. So this is 215 horsepower, the back does 308, the front does 310 Newton meters, the back does 360, which means total output is 523 horsepower and 670 Newton meters of torque. Now, thanks to a little badge on the back, you'll never be able to forget the fact that this thing can go from dead to 100 kilometers an hour in just 3.8 seconds. That is as fast as the majority of the variants from the Porsche lineup for the Taycan and is up to par with some proper performance cars. For 200,000 ringgit, it's a bloody good deal. Now, the thing about BYD being a new company, it means that it has the freedom to set its own laws and rules regarding its design and design language. And for the Seal, we're seeing that even though this is part of the Ocean series of vehicles, the design language is distinctively different from what we've seen before from the Dolphin and the Seagull and other BYDs within that family. So up front, you have these very slim LED headlights, which I think look absolutely fantastic, with the daytime running light living down here, as well as additional lighting in these strakes on the bottom. I'm really not a big fan of this. I would have preferred that not being there because this kind of reminds me of those nasty aftermarket body kits you can get for like Alphards and Velfires. But anyway, so up front you get that massive BYD badge kind of nicely built into the bodywork, which I think looks quite good. And you actually have some functional aerodynamic elements here. This doesn't do anything, but over there it actually channels air over the front wheels in order to keep the profile of this car nice and low and keep the aerodynamic drag nice and low as well. This nose, you'll also notice, sits very low, very similar to a Porsche Taycan. This is obviously to aid aerodynamics. And like the Porsche, you also get these very pronounced wheel arches that sort of bleed into this bonnet, and from the driver's seat you can always see them, and I think that just looks fabulous. Now, down the side you get this, again, useless piece of whatever, but it does say BYD design on it. I certainly think it does make the side of the car look good. You also have the NFC reader on this right-hand side rearview mirror if you choose to use the NFC card to get in and out of your car. And as you move down the side, you get these flush door handles, which the car will honk because the car is actually on. And so they sit nice and flush with the bodywork, again, to improve aerodynamics. And when they do pop out, you get a little BYD badge on them, which I do quite like. You get puddle lights as well, which helps when you're getting in and out of the car at night, should there be anything on the ground. And back here, you get a little bit of glass and then a little bit more of a plastic design element. I do not know why this isn't just completely glass, because that would have really helped rearward visibility, but that's that. Now, this is the charge port. So as I mentioned earlier, the BYD Seal will charge up to 150 kilowatt DC, which means 30 to 80% takes about half an hour or a little bit less than that if I recall correctly. And AC charging is at a mere 7 kilowatts. I am very disappointed by the fact the onboard charger only accepts 7 kilowatts because this is a large battery EV. With 82.5 kilowatt hours, yes, I know I made a mistake earlier, you would have appreciated a 22 kilowatt charger because at least I would have been able to charge this car from dead to full in about 4 hours, or even an 11 kilowatt charger, which would have done a lot better when you're charging overnight. Unfortunately, it's just 7 kilowatts, which based on testing will recharge up to about 40% in a period of 8 to 9 hours. Could have been better. I do, however, appreciate the wheels, which are 19-inch regardless of which variant you go with, and they are wrapped in Continental Eco Contact 6Q tires. Finally, some proper rubber on a BYD. Now, the back of the BYD Seal is, again, another very nice angle because there is quite a few things for you, or rather to draw your eye. So naturally you have this full width LED light bar, which I think looks absolutely fantastic. And obviously on either side you get the brake light housings themselves. So the brakes and the indicators and the reverse lights are all LED. The indicators at the back are scrolling, the ones in the front are not. And you get this nice sort of multi-dot design, which to me looks like a lady's eye with mascara on it. I just think it looks very distinctive. Now underneath you get a diffuser-like element, and I'm not too sure if it's functional, but I'll assume that it is. Oh, by the way, the reverse light is only on this side, the fog light's on that side. Now, when you press this button, which is very exposed, you will find 400 liters of space back here, which is more than enough for 5 people's worth of luggage. There is a pretty decently sized opening for a saloon, and this load lip is not too high. And there's also a false floor back here, which is deep enough for you to hide the charger cables, as well as the little bag for the sunshades, which I'll get onto a little bit later. Now, of course, if you need more space, you can actually fold the rear seats 60-40, and at that point, this car is proven to be large enough to fit a single bed frame dismantled and 2 foldable foam mattresses. Who said saloons are impractical? Now, inside the Seal, this is a far more mature looking cabin than again what we've seen from the brand in the past, simply because vehicles like the Dolphin and the Atto 3 tend to have these more whimsical interiors, which I quite appreciated in the Dolphin but was a little bit too much in the Atto 3, and so people with less of a sense of humor may appreciate this cabin. Evidence of that maturity comes in the overall architecture and the color scheme. So where in the Atto 3 and the Dolphin used to get a whole bunch of colors thrown about the cabin, in here it is black on black on black. The only splashes of color come from the contrast stitching, which you get on the dash top, as well as the door cards, where you get a little bit of blue, which I think looks quite nice, but everything else is black. Now, in typical BYD fashion, interior quality, the material choices in here are fantastic, because while there are scratchy plastics, I admit, like in places like here and up here, honestly, these are not places that you touch very often at all. And so the choice of hard plastics down here is largely due to its durability rather than its quality. In terms of surfaces you will touch, like the top of the dash, for example, and most of the door card is all lovely and soft and pliant, which I think is of a slightly better material choice than what you get in a 3 Series BMW. Again, this is 200,000 ringgit. Now, what's very different for BYD is in terms of the upholstery materials. So for example, we now get this lovely microfiber material on parts of the door cards as well as part of the dash front, but the seats themselves are now done up in genuine leather. This is, again, interesting because BYD normally just sticks with faux leather. The choice of going with full leather is a clear indication of the fact they believe that this is a more upmarket vehicle. Now, moving on to technology, there is quite a bit of it. So up front, you get this massive infotainment screen, which does all of the usual functions you expect, and unfortunately also includes the HVAC controls, which now are doubly infuriating because you no longer have controls for the individual vents. You have to control it in the screen like a Porsche Taycan or a Tesla Model 3. I find that highly irritating because it simply complicates what should otherwise be a very straightforward task. That said, however, at least in terms of manipulating the temperature as well as the fan speed and so on, you can do that either via voice command, or for the driver, you can actually manipulate it through the this heads-up display, which I appreciate very much. This is very customizable in terms of the information that you can get in the middle, as well as the various settings that you can manipulate from this screen. And it is relatively intuitive, which means it doesn't take too long for you to get used to it. Now, on top of this, there is a heads-up display. Again, a first for BYD. Now, admittedly, this heads-up display is relatively limited in terms of its capability. It can only show you sort of basic ADAS functions like your set speed, whether or not your lane centering assist is available, and whether or not it can read road lines, as well as obviously the speed. Everything else is displayed down here, which also includes the usual display of being able to see objects and other vehicles around you, which does help you trust the system more when you do need to use it. Now, in the BYD Dolphin and the BYD Atto 3, we were promised by the brand that Apple CarPlay and Android Auto will come via an over-the-air update. In the Seal, however, it comes as standard with it built in, and it's a wireless system, which means you get to use the twin Qi chargers up front. Now, in terms of the wireless connection, this has to be one of the fastest connecting wireless Android Auto systems I've ever used, because after starting up the vehicle, it boots up within about 10 seconds. And the system itself is also very competent and quite powerful because I can give it voice commands within seconds of getting into the car. Things like, for example, triggering the ventilated seats, which are also not just ventilated, they are also heated should you so want to, and there's also two-stage memory on the driver's side, but to access that, you have to go into the screen. Now, talking about the screen and going back to Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, it is just unfortunate that whenever I use Android Auto, which is all the time, I only get to use it in landscape mode. It's unfortunate because we've seen Android Auto and Apple CarPlay integrated into systems like this in a vertical style, like for example from Volvo, where they could have segmented different parts of the screen to show you different items, so at least that would have allowed me to keep the HVAC controls available on the screen all the time. But this is a relatively small niggle because, again, it works so well. And of course, when you have your Android Auto or Apple CarPlay running, that's where you can really appreciate the Dynaudio system that comes as standard in the BYD Seal, which is absolutely brilliant for the money. Now, EVs generally benefit from the fact that their platforms allow the wheels to be pushed out very far, which is why they usually have unusually long wheelbases. And the benefit of that certainly comes from rear passenger space. With the seat in front of me set up to my driving position, I'm about 170 centimeters. As you can see, I have a palatial amount of knee room. This is actually very comparable to the Kia Carnival. And I do have a relatively long seat bench, which means that once I get my legs down far enough, I do get a decent amount of under-thigh support. Now, the other benefit of EVs is that you have a completely flat floor, which means if you do need to put a third passenger back here, it isn't so bad. This car is decently wide, which means there is actually enough hip room back here. Although, of course, if you only have two passengers in the rear, you also benefit from this central armrest where you have a couple of cup holders. Now, you do get a couple of centrally mounted crotch coolers or rear air conditioning vents in the middle. However, there is no manipulation for them in terms of the fan speed or the temperature because this car is a strictly dual zone climate control system. There is a weird cubby hole underneath the central vents, which leads me to believe that this could have been a 3-zone system, but that was not specified for our market. Now, underneath that, you'll find a USB-A and USB-C port in order to charge devices, but those are the only USB ports that you get in the back of the car. The USB ports for the front live underneath the center console. Again, the benefit of having an EV platform means there is more space underneath. And you can also sync one of the cup holders should you have a taller bottle. Now, coming back to the rear half of the cabin, as you can see, if I were to sit with my legs like this, I really don't have that much under-thigh support. And because the front seats are mounted very low, there is no space for me to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. At least there isn't all that much. And when I do, they're just sort of trapped there, which means to be comfortable back here, you will need to sit at a slight angle or man spread slightly, so consider this more of a 4-seater. In terms of practicality, you get 3 pockets behind each of the front seats. You get relatively large door bins here for large bottles. You get those cup holders I mentioned earlier. And of course, you do get ISOFIX mounts on these 2 outer seats. However, BYD goes one step further by also offering an ISOFIX mount on the front passenger seat, which means if you have a bulky rear-facing child seat, you can mount it there in order to free up more space back here. Although putting a rear-facing child seat back here shouldn't be too difficult because the ISOFIX points are very easy to locate and they're only covered by these rubber tethers. And of course, this legroom, or rather this wheelbase, means that they're not going to really brush the front seats. And the doors themselves, open quite wide, which means there is a decent amount of space. And at night, you can amuse your children with a 64-color ambient lighting system, which also comes with a music rhythm mode, which to me just looks like really tacky Raya lights. Now, I will mention one quick thing about this car, because for testing, I did actually sit in this seat and I was chauffeured around, in essence, for basically a day. And I will note that although the legroom is on the same level as a Toyota Camry, this floor does make a bit of a difference, because you do need to push that front seat a little bit further in order for you to be really comfortable back here. But again, it is not that bad. And in terms of overall NVH, the front windows are all acoustic glass, but the rear ones are not. However, you do not get much in terms of noise intrusion, you just get a little bit of tire roar. But in terms of NVH, to really experience this car, you need to get behind the wheel, because believe me, this car is very impressive. Now, some of you may have noticed in the walk around that I didn't make mention of the glass roof. That is actually one of the things that I can't stand about this car, but I'll get to that a little bit later. Now, behind the wheel of the Seal Performance, now bearing in mind that this is a very, very powerful machine, it's surprisingly easy to live with, provided that you run it in eco mode at least. Because in eco mode, I find that the throttle pedal is very nicely calibrated so that it's always a build-up of power rather than just like this dump of torque, which does always make EVs a little bit easier to drive. I first noted this in the BYD Dolphin, which again makes it a lot more approachable, especially for people who are getting into an EV for the first time. But when you're driving it in normal, that's when you get the majority of the power and the torque that you need with a little bit more immediacy. And of course, in sport, that's when you get that torque dump I mentioned earlier. But again, from behind the wheel, everything here seems very approachable, because the dash is set quite low, and because in order to get comfortable, you have to sit a little bit higher than you might initially expect. You get excellent visibility out the front, as well as excellent visibility out of the side windows as well, because the A-pillar has been profiled in such a way that it minimizes the blind spot, although obviously over the shoulder is somewhat compromised because of what I mentioned about that D-pillar. And being sat here, these seats are amazingly comfortable. BYD does make some very good seats. We noted this in the Atto 3 as well as the Dolphin, that they were very soft and cushiony, but they weren't very supportive. Now, that's acceptable in those cars because those are, pedestrian everyday vehicles. In a vehicle like this, however, where it being a sports saloon, it does mean that it's being bought by the sort of people who want to feel like they're a bit more corseted, a bit more hemmed in. BYD has done a very good job at reprofiling these seats to provide a little bit more support. So for example, I actually enjoy a good degree of shoulder support, which I don't normally get. Most Asians actually don't normally get in a lot of cars, whereas in this car, it's nice and supportive. You also get lumbar support for the first time in a BYD, and admittedly, I would have preferred it if it was a little bit more assertive, because this is not the best system I've ever tried, but it's certainly not bad. And then of course there's the fact that these seats are, as I mentioned earlier, heated and ventilated. And the ventilation, even in its least sort of setting 1 out of 2, it's still very cool and very comfortable indeed. So far so good in terms of driving experience. Now, the steering wheel can be set to 2 different weights. I prefer it in sport because comfort feels unnaturally light and a little bit too over-assisted. And in sport, it's still not unbearably heavy like you get in some cars, and it does provide a certain degree of accuracy and immediacy that you expect from the controls. It doesn't make you feel isolated from the car, it doesn't make you feel detached from it. You don't get feedback through the wheel as you don't on most modern cars, but it's still decent. It's good enough for something like this, because bearing in mind, this is a 200,000 ringgit car. It's not cheap, definitely not, but it's certainly not overtly expensive. Again, the 3 Series BMW will set you back more money. And so far, everything in here does feel pretty good. Now, in terms of the driving dynamics, again, we've seen BYD progress quite steadily. So in the Atto 3, we remarked that it felt like a very Chinese car. It was very soft and very floaty, and its clear goal was overall comfort. Then we got in the Dolphin, the extended range with the multi-link rear suspension, and we noticed that it had a much more European ride. It felt very much like a European hatchback in the sense that it was never uncomfortable, but it does provide a good amount of feedback and feel to the driver. This, however, is evidence of BYD learning as it goes along, because the ride in this car is absolutely spot on. It is never uncomfortable. It provides just enough suspension in order to make the primary and secondary ride feel very good. Although admittedly, the secondary ride is not as planted as you'd expect. So it does take a little bit longer to settle down, but it's certainly not as bad as what we saw from the Atto 3, and certainly not nearly as bad as the Aura 07. But in terms of managing the body weight and the roll and stuff, especially when you're driving enthusiastically through corners, it's surprising how composed the BYD Seal remains. Now, the performance does run on these active frequency dampers, which in theory adjust the damping rate based on the conditions that you're in without any sort of fettling through the central screen or through any of the settings. And I must admit that I can't really tell when it's working or if it's working or how effective it is, because it just works in the background. But in terms of body control and body lean, this car is again surprisingly impressive. It's surprisingly confident for a Chinese car, let alone a nascent Chinese brand. And so when you're driving over longer distances especially, this car remains very composed, even when you're carrying quite a lot of speed, for example, through motorway junctions and through tight corners and stuff like that. But when you're driving on B roads, because I did take this car out to travel a little bit on B roads to see how it would handle, it's still surprisingly good. I wouldn't call this an enthusiast car because I feel that driving enthusiasts demand a little bit more in terms of feel and perhaps are willing to compromise a little bit more on comfort in order to get better control over the vehicle. But it's certainly it'll do well for spirited drivers, I think. And then, of course, once you're done traversing back roads like there's no tomorrow and it's time to go home, that's when the BYD Seal really shines. Because I have so far never driven a Chinese car as quiet as this. Again, this is clear that BYD is learning as it goes along, because the Tesla Model 3 is also an impressively quiet car. But then you have the Ioniq 6, the Ioniq 5, the Kia EV6. These are all very comfortable, very serene vehicles. And this car is on par with the BMW i5 in terms of overall refinement. We're on the Subang Airport Road now, which is a notoriously coarse surface. And even then, all I'm getting is a little bit of tire noise. No doubt by using proper Continental rubber, it's also managed to manage that sound a little bit more. But when you're driving on roads like the Elite or the NKVE motorway, there's almost no noise. And that silence remains all the way up well past the national speed limit, which means, for example, now that it's a bit quieter, this is about all the noise you ever get. And again, past the national speed limit, wind noise is also very well suppressed. This is all, again, proof of BYD learning, because they understand that for vehicles like this, traveling longer distances over higher speed is most likely going to be a priority for its customers. And so they've ensured that this car remains very, very refined. In fact, even being sat in the back while I was being chauffeur driven, again, the amount of noise intrusion is very, very minimal. And you can see evidence of where BYD has done its best to try and minimize noise intrusion. Like I mentioned, the front windows are all acoustic glass, but around all of the doors, there is very, very thick rubber sort of seals all the way around it in order to minimize the amount of noise ingress. Bikes can go past and it's just sort of a suggestion. I used to drive and own an S-Class, and even that was sort of kind of where this car is at in terms of refinement. It's incredible. And of course, without an engine up front, you'll never hear a noise from the engine room intruding into the cabin, even on heavy throttle input. And so this makes the BYD Seal an excellent car to travel in, not just over longer distances, but also even in town, because it impressively insulates you from the world around you, which means that living in here is a lot more comfortable and a lot less taxing than a lot of other cars. Now, the thing about being a sports saloon does mean that this car is not just another product by BYD, but as a sports saloon, it also has to be something of a status symbol. This is designed to compete with the Tesla Model 3, but also by extension, also vehicles like the BMW i4 and the BMW 3 Series and the Mercedes-Benz C-Class and so on and so forth. And so these are cars purchased by people who want to make a statement about the success that they've achieved in life. And so with the looks of this car, as well as its fantastic specifications, I do think that it does very well. And talking about specifications for a moment, again, I remind you, this is a 200,000 ringgit machine. And so it then becomes doubly impressive that it comes as well specified as it does. Because in terms of active safety technology, for example, BYD is not screwing around. This car comes as standard with level 2.5 semi-autonomy, which means you get things like traffic jam assist, autonomous emergency braking, adaptive cruise control with lane keep and lane centering assist, and lane departure warning. You get 360-degree cameras that you saw earlier that were incredibly sharp. And you get all of these little things that just make life in this car really, really easy. When you're stuck in a traffic jam, for example, like I was over the week that I've had this car, I have just let the active cruise control do its thing because I can trust it. In fact, even when I'm driving over longer distances, like I'm traveling between cities, I just let the integrated or the intelligent cruise control, the ICC system, do the heavy lifting because it is that dependable. Admittedly, yes, it does keep a little bit too much of a distance from the car in front, as is emblematic of most Chinese vehicles, but that's not exactly a bad thing. And because of that gap, it does mean that when a car does cut in front, the car still has time to react. It's not too jarring or uncomfortable for passengers, so you can just let the car do the work. So ultimately, who does this car appeal to? Well, I would assume that the buyers of a BYD Seal or prospective buyers are also people shopping for a Mercedes-Benz C-Class, an Audi A4, a BMW 3 Series, as well as electric competitors like the Tesla Model 3 and so on. You also have wider market competitors like the Toyota Camry and by some extension the Mazda 6 for as long as that remains available. And so when you put all of those competitors together, the Seal does hold up really well. Its abilities as a chauffeur car is still very impressive, although obviously not quite as good as a Camry. And I would argue that this is quieter than the Tesla Model 3 and certainly more refined than the GWM Aura 07. So do I think that this is the best car in the segment? And do I think that this is worthy of your 200,000 bucks? Well, yes and no. Because on the one hand, I do think that this car represents excellent value. For 200,000 ringgit, you are getting unparalleled levels of performance. However, to me, the performance is not really that big of a deal because my primary concern has to do with range. And so rather than the performance, I think that I would be better suited in the Seal Premium, which is hardly a slouch. 0 to 100 in about 5.9 or under 6 seconds makes it plenty fast enough. But there are people who want that kind of capabilities with their cars. And so in that regard, if you're that kind of buyer, then yes, the Seal performance will certainly appeal to you. I think it drives brilliantly, and I think that even if you're not the most enthusiastic driver, you will appreciate the manner with which this car was built and the manner with which this car is engineered. It is a fantastically impressive machine, not just for 200,000 ringgit, but this car would be impressive for 300, 400,000 ringgit even. It really does punch above its weight, and that is very, very commendable. I absolutely would buy a Seal. It's just that my conundrum now is whether or not I want to save the 20 to 30 grand by getting a premium or by splurging and enjoying the ultimate Seal experience. But either way, I think if I had the money, this is definitely the car for me. And if you've ever wondered why I've never said that or very rarely have said that, it's because very rarely have cars impressed me this much. I really, really do like this, and I'm very sad to see it go, but that's just how this story goes. In any case, that has been our review of the BYD Seal Performance. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. And of course, if you have friends or family looking at cars like these, or they're looking for buying advice, we really do appreciate sharing it far and wide. And of course, you can join our new WhatsApp channel so that you can get all of the latest automotive news and information all right in your WhatsApp. In any case, take care, stay safe, and as always, jangan bodoh.